I'm fine.
Welcome. Hello, everybody. Good evening. I'm Amira Jarmakani. I'm the director of Institute for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And I want to thank you so much for coming to our 20th anniversary event. It's our big shebang, the final culminating event that we're really excited about. I thought I would just say a couple words. Actually, I would just characterize for you in one little quick snapshot how we've been thinking about the 20th anniversary, which you probably have seen on our materials, which is to say that it's been 40 years of struggle and 20 years as an institute. And so just to sort of mark the way that we see it as a kind of, to mark, first of all, the fact that the work in women's gender and sexuality studies here at GSU got started really 40 years ago with the first working group in 1974. And to think about all of the work, I would invite you to go to our website and look at the timeline that sort of characterizes some of the ways in which that work had been done and the different permutations it's taken over the years. And also that we're thinking of it as a theme of a way of thinking about our ongoing work and the futures of our work, and also the ways in which the Institute has really been engaged in and interested in creative troublemaking and creative forms of troublemaking throughout its history. So we hope that will continue as well. Today I wanted to first tell you a little bit about the lecture itself. Tonight's lecture, the Ann L. Harper Annual Lecture in Women's Studies, we're lucky to be able to offer every year. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about Ann Harper herself. She's a dedicated academic, political, and professional. She's had a dedicated academic, political, and professional careers, all focusing on women in education. She's got her PhD from the University of Michigan and her BA from Smith, and in fact taught the first ever women in political philosophy class at Emory University in 1998. Though she has a PhD, she left academia to pursue a career in consulting and also to hold public office. She served on the Board of Public Education in pre-K through 12 for 8 years. And is really an example of the politically engaged women's studies student from the 70s, so really within the theme of that 40 years of struggle that we were sort of mentioning before. And I just thought I would tell you a little bit about what she's doing now. She's established Harper Consulting, which is a non-profit management consulting practice. And she's been a long-time activist on behalf of women and girls, having worked with state legislators here in Georgia to initiate the Equity in Sports Act of 2000, incorporating Title IX into Georgia law. And she's also served on the boards of many different organizations. I'll just name a few: the Feminist Women's Health Center, Atlanta Partners for Education, Odyssey, and more recently, Cool Girls and Girls on the Run in Atlanta. So thankful both to have the support to offer this lecture annually and to have it in the spirit of the things that we imagine ourselves to be about. So I'll move on from there to announce our annual Ann Harper lecture speaker for tonight, Janet Jakobsen. She's the director of the Center for Research on Women at Barnard and also the Whitney Olin Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. She's got her PhD from Emory University, just down the road, as some of the others in the room do as well. And so she sort of knows a lot about our context. And I could name a lot of, I could go through a long list of her publications. I'll name some of the more recent: a co-edited book about secularisms, a co-written book, Love the Sin, Sexual Regulation and the Limits of Religious Tolerance, which we teach quite often here in our classes, and other edited collections and books and numerous articles about a range of topics, from the Monica Lewinsky affair. And I noticed that as an extension of that, you recently gave a talk or spoke about Clinton running, or the possibilities of her running and what that might mean and how we might think about that. But what I really wanted to highlight is the two things in particular that especially frame both the anniversary event, the ways that we've been thinking about rumination. The two things that I would highlight are when I think about Janet's work, I think about two main areas of focus. One is a real emphasis on the ways that gender and sexuality are public issues. Despite having long histories of being thought of and framed as private issues, and really her work being at the forefront of putting those concerns on the agenda as central to the ways that we think about many things that are happening and going on, namely, for instance, the 2008 economic crisis and of course its situatedness within the longer legacy of neoliberalism, for instance. The other thing that I think about is a real engagement with the question of one that we've been sort of discussing throughout the day today, a real question of the engagement between theory and what we called in our first panel, the world. All of the ways of talking about it really end up replicating that weird problematic binary. But so that's another way in which I think her framing and thinking about the work that she does and the work that she brings really helps us to think through the hard questions that we want to be thinking through, not just about our 20th anniversary and where we've been, but how we want our legacy of creative troublemaking to be framed, and also where we want it to go, what the forms of creative troublemaking will take as we move forward. So, with no further ado, I'll invite you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on a Friday evening. I am extremely happy to be with you. I was supposed to fly out of LaGuardia yesterday, so I was very uncertain I was going to make it here. I moved over to New Jersey, and apparently by going to New Jersey, you can solve many problems, including how to get to Atlanta. I'm sorry I missed the earlier conversations today. I was very much looking forward to getting to talk with all of you about the state of the field and where we might go from here in terms of creative troublemaking. So I hope that this paper will be a contribution to those discussions, and I look forward to some question and answer afterwards. I do want to thank Amira and everyone at the Institute for inviting me to participate in this wonderful forum, including the former chair, Susan Talbert, who was gloating about not being chair anymore just a few minutes ago, and the planners, Megan Sinnott and Juliana Kabala, Andy Reisinger, Andy. I do want to also give special thanks to both Juliana Kabala and Donna Jo Smith. Where'd she go? They were in my cohort at Emory University, and together we learned how to learn and many other things. And so I'm really very grateful to them for everything that they've contributed to my thinking, my activism over the course of these years. The whole connection that Amira was talking about between thinking and activism. I was a full-time organizer before I went to graduate school, and we were, I think, as a cohort, able to carry a lot of that on in the course of our time at Emory. So it was very fortunate. All right. I work, now I'm going to try to go back and forth between the screen and, how do I unmute the screen?
Now it says unblink.
Okay. Okay. Between the screen and my talks. So this is where I work. This is the Barnard Center for Research on Women. We just had the 40th anniversary of our annual conference, the Scholar and Feminist Conference. So I'm very familiar with how important anniversaries are and also how daunting they are. And I'm very glad to be here today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this masthead, which I love very much, the way that it is put together so that the seams of building knowledge show. So as I was saying in my job as director of BCRW, now only I know what I'm going to say. I've had to produce any number of anniversary celebrations, which indicates good fortune. I mean, I'm very grateful for each of these as they come up because it indicates that BCRW, which was founded in 1971, continues to be a thriving institution, just as the Institute here has done incredible work over these past, not just 20, but 40 years. And I love the title that you've chosen for your celebration, which Amira mentioned, the 40 years of struggle and 20 years as an institute, because it has been a struggle. We entered graduate school in 1987, so we here for almost, is it true, 30 years of that struggle, and it has been daunting at times. It's been a struggle to maintain these institutions of scholarship on women's gender and sexuality struggles that are represented by institutes, centers, programs, and departments around the United States and around the world. And it's a struggle that has shifted over time from the heady days of founding institutions to the longer and sometimes more tedious struggle to maintain them. And part of what can make the struggle tedious, at least in my experience, is that the fact that we do so often in the face of claims that take a couple of different and even potentially contradictory forms. One of which is that the feminist project is simply finished. Either it's just dead, and if you go back over the history of feminism in the United States since the 1960s, you see that feminism is declared by the mainstream media dead over and over again, 1968, 1980, whatever, right? And so you begin to think perhaps it's more of a wish than reporting a fact. But nonetheless, this sense that feminism is over, it's either dead or it's not needed. Everybody's a feminist. We don't need to think about feminism anymore. Isn't that great? Glad that we finished that one. And then the other big claim that I've spent a lot of my time focusing on that makes, I think, it difficult to maintain these institutions is the one that Amira mentioned, which is that there's a sense that feminism and women's gender and sexuality studies are somehow private issues that should not be shared in public and that are not related to public issues or to what are sometimes called the real questions. So the real questions are not those of gender and sexuality, they are those of economics and justice, war and peace, climate change, the future of the planet. These are the real things, and it's nice to study women in your free time, but you really should focus on the real stuff. And certainly the response to the volume on Monica Lewinsky, which was edited by Lauren Berlant and Lisa Dugan, was very much along this line, like, you know, we impeached a president over sexuality, but why do you bother to do scholarly work on it? That's just ridiculous. Now, what I want to talk with you about today is that while these claims are not uncommon, they are, in fact, unfounded. And we know this for a lot of different reasons. Even if we look at the most simple indicators of injustice, we see that it persists, and it persists on the basis of gender and sexuality. Just as one example, the American Association of University Women has put out a study on the gender wage gap in its series of reports, which is entitled The Simple Truth. And the simple truth, apparently, is that at its median, the wage gap in the United States between men and women remains at a stubborn 78 cents for women on the dollar that men earn. So 78% women earn 78% of what men earn in median terms. And we should also remember when talking about the wage gap that the national minimum wage in the United States is still not considered a living wage, which this makes no sense at all. So thinking about something as basic as labor and wages, we tend to begin to see that maybe gender and sexuality matter after all. There is also, though, this sometimes commonsensical discourse in the U.S. that injustice will end and the wage gap, for example, will close pretty much at any minute. You know, it's just a matter of time, it's just a matter of progress, just wait. But this narrative, too, the progress narrative, is unfounded, and that's going to be one of my main points for today, which is thinking about how this narrative is misleading, and that when we adopt it, we, in fact, go down roads that may not, in fact, address questions of injustice. Not only, just to give you an example of the ways in which the wage gap is startlingly persistent, I started teaching in 1992 at the University of Arizona. At that time, the wage gap was 68 cents on the dollar that men earned. And I was teaching a book, and I brought it because part of this is about history, called The Black Woman, which is an anthology that was edited by Tony Cade Barbara. And I was teaching an essay from this by Frances Beale, which is called Double Jeopardy, and it includes statistics on the wage gap from when the book was published, so from the late 1960s, and the book is published in 1970. And so 20 years before I started teaching, I learned that the median wage gap was 62 cents on the dollar. So in 20 years, the gap had changed an entire 6 cents. And then in the 20 years since I began teaching, we've gained another 10 cents. So the sense that progress toward justice is always being made, that full equality is just around the corner, is one of the propositions that I want to bring into question today. At the Barnard Center for Research on Women, we once did a project on race and gender equity in the academy, and the background research for this project included studies that modeled the rate of change we could expect with a continuation of the current hiring, retention, and promotion practices. And they showed that we could expect these practices to produce equity in the academy exactly never. That was kind of shocking to me. I thought, 100 years, no, never. The point of Frances Beale's essay is that the category of women itself is not so simple, and that feminism needs to attend to these complexities so that we can understand, for example, that when it comes to race and gender segregated labor markets and their effects on wages, Black women face double jeopardy. This idea has, of course, since been developed into the concept of intersectionality, and for now, which runs in one way through the paper as a whole, although I don't refer to it a lot. But I do want to highlight that one of the ways the progress narrative is maintained, so one of the ways in which we get the sense that progress is always happening, except it never does, is precisely by ignoring the interrelations among what in the field now we sometimes call social differences like race and class. In other words, the progress narrative covers over the continuing need to address social differences and inequality. So the sense of progress is, well, we don't need feminism because if it's not over now, it will be soon. And it also, one of the supporting plot points of this narrative is the separation of gender from race, of race from sexuality, of gender and class, for example. We also know that claims for feminism's irrelevance are unfounded because the idea of a division between the real issues and those of women, gender, and sexuality studies is in fact not a true narrative, but part of what ensures that we will never reach equity, much less equality. One of the central insights of feminist study over the last 40 years has been not only that women's gender and sexuality studies touch upon and are central to every issue, but that taking feminist studies seriously would significantly shift our perspective on any issue. Thus, if we're studying economic issues without some significant attention to women, gender, and sexuality studies, then our chances of creating a just economy are significantly lowered. And yet, that's pretty much what happens in a large swath of academic research, and it's certainly what happens in the pages of mainstream media, the New York Times or other newspapers every day. My point here is not just that it's unfair not to include women, gender, and sexuality in our analyses, although that's true, but that by not including these topics, we undercut the accuracy of our analysis. Without thinking about the questions raised by all the various institutes, centers, departments, and programs that are like the one here at Georgia State, it will be very difficult to develop an accurate picture of our world. And thus it will be nearly impossible to develop ways of effectively responding to both the problems and the possibilities of the world around us. So what I'd like to do today is to provide some examples both of how the study of women, gender, and sexuality might change our understanding of the world, and how some of the tools and methods of conceptualization that have been developed in the field over these past decades can affect that. I saw an earlier version of the program that included the idea that one of the panels was going to be on what's sexy or sexy methods in women's studies right now, and I was attracted to that idea. I actually think both method and also infrastructure are sexy things. That's not a generally shared proclivity, but and I could do this whole paper on method, but because it's not a generally shared proclivity, I thought probably not best. But I do appreciate the idea that thinking about the methods that we have developed here in the field can help us to understand our world better. And just to go back for a minute to that masthead, I see a couple of different things in the way in which this is put together, where we see the ways in which knowledge has developed over time, and the seams of our knowledge project become visible. So in reading into that image, which I can't show you while reading into it, so that's a technological problem, which is that I want to emphasize that as we celebrate the history of the field, it is not that where we are now supersedes where we were then. My good friend Jose Munoz wrote a book called Cruising Utopia, the then and there of queer possibility or something like that. And the point of that book is that it's not that we are always going forward and therefore we have to turn away from our history, but rather that we are engaged in it in important ways. And that's why I brought this book in addition to the fact that it is one of my favorites. And also I continue to find Frances Beale's work helpful conceptually as well as historically. And the other thing that I think this drawing in of gender and sexuality in conjunction with women shows is that each of these categories remains important. None of them can provide a complete articulation of our social relations, and even together they are limited in various ways, including the ways in which they tend to focus on what we might call one axis of social difference and not on the interconnections. But these limits don't mean that they're not useful. I hope to show today that each of these terms remains useful, particularly if we acknowledge the limits. Similarly, I find that the analytic paradigms we use in relation to these categories are themselves complex. I was for a long time working with an understanding of a book that I read in college, and Julie told me she read it in college too, so apparently it was read in colleges around the country, which was Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And it argued that as one mode of analysis would be dominant and then it would turn over into another one. And I think we've sometimes fallen into that understanding of what we're doing in women's studies, where one mode of analysis will go forward for a while and then fall over into another one. But what I've found myself doing is something that is much more like stitching together things that I have now learned over these decades that I have been working in the field, something that looks much more like this. And that's what I'm going to try to do for you today. So my hope is that we can use different sexy methods all at one time. In addition to the anniversary of the Institute, we are, of course, approaching the 50th anniversary tomorrow of attempts by civil rights activists to march from Selma to Montgomery, which has occasioned both a number of ceremonies honoring those whose courage in the face of violence remains so moving to us today, as well as the retelling of the stories of the movement, like that undertaken by director Ava DuVernay in the film Selma. Historians have also been rethinking the civil rights movement in the United States. A group of scholars have been looking to precursors to the movement even before key moments like the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in 1965. And they have developed a view that is now termed the long civil rights movement. And there's a big archive online at the University of North Carolina History Department that gives you some of the documents from the long civil rights movement. These historians are arguing against a usual way of telling the narrative of the civil rights movement. And that usual way is to begin in 1954 with the US Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Board of Education. This decision declared segregation in US public schools to be unconstitutional. Or another beginning point might be the 1955 bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, a boycott that famously began when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white person and moved to the back of the bus. The movement is generally then understood to last through the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs, Peace, and Justice, the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And I will come back to what the Supreme Court has done, did 2 years ago in relation to the Voting Rights Act, and until the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. The proponents of the long civil rights movement look to those people and actions that made the signal victories in Little Rock and Montgomery, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act possible. They looked to the labor activism of the 1930s as central to the possibilities for civil rights struggle in the 1950s and 60s, and they looked to the intertwining of civil rights and feminism. Feminist movements and anti-racist movements in the United States have been complexly intertwined since at least the 19th century in ways that have been both mutually supportive and deeply antagonistic. And these movements continue to develop together after 1968. Scholars like Roderick Ferguson have shown how thinking about movements that proceed from 1968, including feminist and anti-racist movements and also anti-colonial and queer movements, understanding all of this as going forward is crucial to our understanding both of the civil rights movement itself and of social possibilities today. In other words, one of the reasons it is so hard to bring together different social movements is that we have told the story of these movements as if they are separate movements that then have to be brought together. And in telling the story of separate movements, we have extracted from each of these movements the elements that might in fact tie them together. Thus, we remove the very foundation on which connections might be built as we move forward. And we also ignore the ways in which conflicts among movements have constituted what we now understand to be feminist or anti-racist. If instead we begin at the historical points of interaction, it's possible to rethink both the histories of these movements and how we might frame movements for justice today. For example, if we look at the Montgomery bus boycott through the lens of the long civil rights movement, what we find is that feminist activism, for example, activism against sexual violence, was absolutely central to the project of civil rights activism. It was no accident that Rosa Parks provided the spark for the boycott with her arrest. Specifically, as historian Danielle McGuire traces in her recent book, At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape, and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power, Parks had been involved in campaigns against sexual violence for years before the bus boycott. In the mid-1940s, Parks was sent by the NAACP branch for which she worked to investigate a brutal rape committed by 7 white men who would have remained in their community with impunity had it not been for the actions of Parks and her fellow organizers. Campaigns to end violence against women were part of the necessary groundwork for the movement that followed. And crucially for my talk today, women organizers and feminist issues remain central as what is generally thought of as the short civil rights movement, as the civil rights movement itself got underway. My understanding about this centrality is built in part on the basis of a project that BCRW has been involved with since 2008 with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And this project is called Valuing Domestic Work. You can find it, not that one, this one, on our website. We worked with NDWA at their very formation through the passage of the New York State Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, and we recently did another big conference with them on their research. Their argument of NDWA is that we cannot tell accurate histories of either labor or activism without attention to domestic workers, and it's a powerful argument. A significant proportion of the users of the Montgomery City buses were, in fact, domestic workers, African-American women who traveled from their homes in the segregated parts of the city to work in white homes and returned at the end of each day by bus. When these women stopped riding the buses in what was initially supposed to be a one-day, 24-hour boycott, but it turned into a year-long action, they literally broke the chokehold of the Montgomery bus boycott and its segregation. Thus, it is not wrong that we remember Martin Luther King Jr., who was a young pastor in Montgomery at the time and whose church organizing, preaching, and speeches helped to maintain the boycott over the arduous year of action. But if we forget about these women, the domestic workers, who were the ones carrying out the action, sometimes walking for miles to and from work each day, while also carrying out the physical demands of domestic work and caring for their own families, then we forget two things. We forget women who were heroes, I think, in the civil rights movement. And we forget the ways in which women in an occupation that is specifically gendered as female in the United States, domestic work, and that is done in the US predominantly by women of color, we forget how they were actors that propelled the boycott and much of the movement that followed to success. This alternative understanding of social movements has implications for how we understand possibilities for justice today as well. For example, producing a full understanding of economic justice in the contemporary moment requires, as Frances Beale suggests, a connected analysis of sexism and racism. And as NDWA suggests, it also requires attention to the ways in which a service economy enables contemporary economic practices and policies. Just as domestic work was central to the question of economic justice in the middle of the 20th century, it is similarly important today. NDWA argues that instead of understanding domestic labor as anomalous, so the way that labor organizing usually understands domestic work is it's a specialized, privatized form of labor that happens in homes and therefore is not the site for labor organizing. They argue quite the opposite, that it is not a special kind of labor in the private sphere, but that we should understand domestic labor as a model for all kinds of labor in the global economy. Unlike the paradigmatic factory worker of the industrial economy, the domestic worker is a service worker who often finds work through transnational migration and labors under conditions of great vulnerability. As even professional jobs move toward consulting and freelancing done on a job-by-job basis and often across borders, the conditions of labor for domestic workers are extending to broader swaths of the economy as a whole. So, for example, we could have a long discussion about how adjunct labor in the academy is part of this particular organization of labor and the various inequities and injustices that attend to it. Moreover, an analysis that centers not just domestic life but domestic work can help us understand the ways in which public and private spheres are interdependent. This very question of how feminism, women, gender, sexuality get pushed away from ideas about what is important in terms of social life. Thus, a vision of justice that includes possibilities for both new economies and new solidarities can be built in part through overcoming divisions in both scholarly analysis and movement practice among gender, sexuality, race, and nation. If we don't take domestic labor into account, for instance, then we miss something important about both the history of the civil rights movement and the current workings of the global economy. In the past 40 years of feminist scholarship, we've also learned that it's important to be able to trace the dynamic nature of interrelations among gender, sex, race, nation, and economics. For example, the progress narrative that is so central to telling the story of the U.S. social movements depends on the impression that issues are resolved one at a time, and that this singular resolution is part of the long march of progress, an expansion of democracy within the United States. My critique of this narrative, the progress narrative, has been informed by my participation in another project, a transnational project on gender and religion, which focuses on post-colonial, post-secular, and queer perspectives. And my engagement with that project led me to return to a book from the 1990s, which was written by Dipesh Chakrabarty, that's called Provincializing Europe. I'm trained in religious studies, and I've worked, as Amira mentioned, a lot on questions of secularism, and this book includes a critique of secularism, but when I returned to it, I remembered that it also includes a critique of history and sociology, and in fact of all of social analysis. So I hope that you will forgive me for just a moment. I'm going to talk about secularization, and that will bring us back to the question of the progress narrative. So the secularization narrative is also, as Chakrabarty points out, a sociology of religion. And by a sociology, he's interested in the ology part, in the logic that is internal to this narrative and to the idea of development. That's what he's mostly concerned about. In religious studies, secularism has been seen as a question of evolution. But his critique applies to all narratives of progressive movement of social change. His concern is that in narrating history, one is also acceding to the terms of secularization, to the narrative of progress, development, and evolution, in which some people are more developed, some nations are more developed than others. And as he famously says, those who refuse to accept the logic of this narrative, including those who, for him, continue to live with gods, are consigned to what he famously calls the waiting room of history. It is through this mechanism of consigning some people to wait for their rights that popular culture in the United States can maintain a predominant understanding of social equality despite the manifest inequality of our social relations. Given the intensity of inequality in our society, you might wonder how it is that we have also a popular culture that assumes that everybody is equal. Some people are poor while others are rich, but in this narrative, the one that Chakrabarty is critiquing, the poor might catch up. Wealth might trickle down or they might get rich. And we must also admit that some people are accorded rights while others are not in the United States. Whether they're racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTIQ people, women, these people must fight for their rights. One might think that given that the groups that have to fight for their rights constitute the majority of the population, the need for so many fights would undercut people's sense of equality in the United States. But in fact, that's not the case. Rather, the predominant narrative, which can be found anywhere you look, in U.S. Public discourse, across various disciplines in the academy, the predominant narrative is that democracy expands. Yes, the narrative goes, it may be that once upon a time not everyone was equal, but the march of freedom and equality are such that more and more people are brought into this realm of expanding democracy. It's only a matter of time until the wage gap is over. And U.S. history is often told as if one group after another does receive rights. For example, African Americans were granted rights with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and then again with the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, offering the vote to African American men in 1870. And women with the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920, and then African Americans again with the Civil Rights Movement in 1964, and the vote again in 1965. Lesbian women again, and gay men again with their civil rights. Then we think further, what about Native Americans whose religious rights are continue to be fought in the U.S. Supreme Court to very little avail? Or how do we think about Asian Americans with immigration reform in 1965, or maybe with amnesty in 1986, or maybe with immigration reform now? So how is it that despite this steady march of progress, we still don't have equality? Suddenly, instead of facing what looked like a steady march of equality with one group after another stepping forward to claim their rights, we find ourselves in a much more tangled world. The waiting room of history is, it seems, a very busy place, not only crowded with the majority of the world's people, but the people seem to be constantly moving. They're supposedly moving forward and yet also seem to need to redo this very movement again and again. The progress narrative, insofar as it is dedicated to change over time, allows us to think that people are moving out of the waiting room. Someone is finally getting to see the doctor. And yet this very movement makes it impossible to see that the waiting room remains stubbornly, persistently full. Not to push the metaphor too far, but we know in the United States that those who spend a lot of their time in the hospital emergency room are doomed by the very fact that this is the room in which they wait to see the doctor to return again and again. Yet this return is virtually invisible because the progress narrative demands a sense of movement. This is something that I call mobility for stasis, the sense that things are moving and yet everything remains the same. In other words, the idea that the more things change, the more they stay the same is not descriptive, it's prescriptive. We have a system that is set up to make this so. The effects of this system of mobility for stasis are all too clear in the work of the United States Supreme Court over the past few years. We can, for example, look to a series of rulings that came out in the week of June 24th, 2013. The rulings were on affirmative action, on the Voting Rights Act, and on same-sex marriage. The first of these cases, which was on affirmative action at the University of Texas, it's called Fisher versus the University of Texas, Austin, focused on the constitutionality of taking race into account as part of a process of determining admissions to the university. In this case, a young white woman who had been denied admission sued the university, claiming that race-based admission standards had denied her access. The court did not strike down all admissions policies, but they did raise the standard for policies being acceptable to what is called strict scrutiny by the courts. The decision left open the possibility of affirmative action possibilities that would overcome the bar of strict scrutiny, but the decision also made it more difficult for university affirmative action programs to be acceptable in the eyes of the court system in the United States. Although this decision allowed affirmative action policies to continue for the moment, and this case is actually being appealed again, it's like rehearing the Affordable Care Act case, which happened this week, again, over and over again, lots of mobility, lots of stasis. The decision, nonetheless, has continued to have effects beyond the immediate question of whether the policies themselves were struck down. As commentators both before and after the decision repeatedly pointed out, it provided a sense in which supposedly race-neutral means of ensuring fairness in university admissions could address diversity, but could do so in class rather than race-conscious ways. For example, policy institutes like the Washington think tank The Century Fund have advocated class-based approaches to university admissions, arguing that, quote, new admissions preferences to low and income and working class students of all races are better than those focused on race. And in fact, Texas has such a policy, the 10% rule, and the affirmative action policy is to expand on that. So what is at question is precisely, should we be doing one issue at a time, or should we in fact look at the interrelations among issues? My point here is not that class is not crucial in thinking about fairness in the university. The university is, after all, one of the fundamental institutions for class sorting in the United States. Rather, my point is that the way in which university admissions policies have worked in the United States is in and through the intertwining of class and race. After the Second World War, the United States offered veterans access to higher education in ways that changed the face of higher education. There was a major expansion of the university system, and also entire groups of people who would not have had access to higher education were able to enter on what was called the GI Bill. This was a major shift in class relations, allowing for class mobility that would not have otherwise been possible. But it is also a moment that Ira Katznelson has called affirmative action for white people, because the military was segregated during World War II, and the vast majority of beneficiaries of this policy were white. In fact, it was a moment in which various Americans who had not previously understood themselves to be white, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, even my father and his Norwegian relatives, they understood themselves to be ethnic, and they became white. This intertwining of class mobility, ethnic change, and racial segregation is what solidified the post-war racial hierarchy in the United States, thus ensuring the need for the civil rights movement in the decades that followed. In other words, equality did not flow in a simple line of progress from Harry Truman's 1948 order to desegregate the armed forces. Segregation had already done its work and denied the GI Bill to an entire generation of African Americans. In the current moment, the continuation of segregation in housing combined with the funding of schools through property taxes and the districting of schools means the schooling also continues to be one of the primary means of perpetuating both income inequality and white supremacy. Just last Sunday in the New York Times, for example, there was a letter to the editor from a young man who identified as white and who listed the ways in which he and his peers from poor rural areas both suffered discrimination and economic injustice and still did not suffer in the same ways as African Americans. The switch from race to class, advocated by commentators like those at the New Century Fund, is the type of movement among social relations that seem to make sense when analyzed on their own, but that miss crucial elements of the social fabric when any single thread is pulled out. This kind of shifting amongst elements in a social fabric has additional effects. In particular, it allows for an appearance of mobility, progress on one front, while the fundamental social relations of domination and oppression remain the same. Because the United States Supreme Court has been an important player in the narrative of historical progress, it then can also use this very narrative of progress as a basis on which to halt mobility on certain fronts. On Tuesday, June 25th, after the affirmative action decision, the court handed down a decision on the Voting Rights Act in a case called Shelby County versus Holder. This case was based on the idea, the decision was based on the idea that racism was over and federal oversight of voting laws was no longer necessary. The federal government could choose to renew its oversight if it gave new justification for it, but the court knew perfectly well that a Congress that at that time had passed fewer pieces of legislation in its first year than any previous session of the US Congress was hardly going to come together on this highly charged issue. Effectively, even if not technically, the Voting Rights Act had been gutted, and the reasoning was that racism just doesn't matter anymore. The majority decision argued that because voting rights had been extended decades before, there was no longer any evidence for the contemporary existence of the type of racism that had led to the need for federal oversight of voting in those states that had essentially denied voting rights to African Americans in the past. This claim was made despite the fact that a number of these very states had readied legislation to immediately revoke voting rights protections, and such legislation has continued apace since the decision. If the June 24, 2013 decision on affirmative action was part of a larger argument based on the idea that racism is over and we should instead focus on remedying inequities like those of class, then the voting rights decision released the next day on June 25 took this argument a step further to claim that remedies for racism that had been provided by the court system in the US may no longer be necessary at all. And then, on Wednesday, June 26, 2013, came the decision on same-sex marriage, striking down the Defense of Marriage Act in U.S. versus Windsor, and refusing to rule on California's Proposition 8 in Hollingsworth versus Perry. These two decisions allowed the Proposition 8 decision allowed the earlier court ruling invalidating Proposition 8 to stand. So Proposition 8 was a ballot initiative against gay marriage. It was voided by the court, and then the Supreme Court upheld that voiding of it. And so, by Wednesday of that week, we now have the long march toward democracy in the United States. First, the U.S. did away with racism, and now it is doing away with discrimination against homosexuality. In the narrative of the March of Progress, gay rights are connected to other civil rights, but only as separate steps on the path toward full democracy. They are not interactive. If we fail to analyze them together, then the fight against gay rights can be the civil rights issue of the moment, and it's talked about that in the popular press all the time, and it can replace the fight against racism. This is a problem on two counts. First, gay rights is being used to enforce the idea that racism is over, and now that marriage has supposedly become legal, and of course there are ongoing battles about that fact, gay rights will be declared over just as soon as the court rules on this issue later in June of this year. And anything else that might be associated with gay rights, protection against employment discrimination, for example, will be unnecessary. As with race, it will be time to move on. Taken together, this set of cases released 3 days in a row produce an overarching narrative. Despite the direct hits that were taken by the cause of civil rights, we are still to think that progress marches on. By shifting among class, race, and sexuality, the components of the assemblage that makes for domination in the United States come together to produce a hegemonic social fabric. And they do so precisely because of their discontinuities. Because race and class are sometimes distinguished from each other and sometimes opposed to each other, they actually then become interdependent in a narrative that supports both race and class domination. Sexuality is brought into play in a way that effectively indicates that despite a major setback in civil rights, the gay rights movement in the civil rights struggle on which the gay rights movement is supposedly based, progress toward democracy continues. And indeed, on Thursday and Friday of that week in June, all the major news outlets talked about was the historic victory for gay rights, not the historic loss for civil rights, even as several states around the country moved to change their laws on voting rights. Then, in 2014, the court turned the wheel again with its decision in Hobby Lobby versus Burwell. This is a case that took up the question, and it's a question related to the Affordable Care Act, what is called Obamacare, of whether a closely held corporation, this is a corporation that is not publicly traded, whether a closely held corporation can deny insurance coverage on contraception to their employees on the basis of religious freedom. Thus, it challenged the mandate to cover contraception, which was part of the regulations that came out of the Affordable Care Act. It was not part of the act itself. In a widely discussed decision written by Justice Samuel Alito, the court ruled 5-4 in favor of the religious freedom of the owners of Hobby Lobby. So they were allowed, if they claimed that it was their religious belief, to deny certain forms of contraception insurance coverage to their employees, regardless of what the religious beliefs of the employees were. There's a lot to say about this case. I have a whole other religious studies paper on it. But I'm particularly interested here in the relation to the cases of 2013. Most importantly, in his opinion, Alito states quite clearly that while religious freedom was the foundational principle in this case, it would never be used, religious freedom would not be used to override the state's compelling interest in preventing racism. So in this decision, racial justice provided the grounds for the court's claim that freedom in gender and sexuality could be set back for the sake of a new understanding of religious freedom. And the basis for not taking that as a blow to civil rights was their commitment to racial justice. In the summer of 1913, however, we will remember that racial justice could be set back because there was forward progress on gay rights. In other words, in the space of a single year, the U.S. Supreme Court has shown us the tangle of social relations that make up mobility for stasis. While different groups move forward and backwards at different times, so it appears as if democracy is expansive, when in fact this tangle ensures that the fundamental hierarchy of U.S. society never changes. One of the great accomplishments of feminist studies in the last 40 years is the ability to conceptualize the distinct but inseparable social relations whose dynamic interactions make up the social body as a whole. If we simply add up these different sets of relations or put them one in front of the other, then we fail to see how movement among them welds together the edifice of overarching injustice. When we put together different sets of social relations in dynamic and interactive movement, we can come to understand how together they build a narrative in which the United States appears to be continually making progress toward equality, and yet inequality remains a perennial fact of life. The bracing news that comes of this analysis is that even after 40 years of struggle in both feminist scholarship and activism, these mechanisms, the social mechanisms of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and so much more, remain persistently active. The good news, however, is that the work of gender, women's, and sexuality studies is also active. And we have actively produced methods, including sexy methods, by which we can identify these mechanisms. We can think of various forms of gender justice, including justice for trans people, for gender variant people who don't fit the categories of binary gender in many ways. We can think about what gender justice might actually mean and about how it can be accomplished and about how all kinds of issues are part and parcel of social justice feminism. And I just want to go back to the BCRW website to show how this is possible. In the past several years, we've had the chance to work with Jody Williams, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for the International Campaign on Landmines. This project was in 2002, which was about other ways of responding to the 9/11 attacks that didn't necessarily include bombing people. Last year, we had the chance to work with Lema Bowie, who also won the Nobel Peace Prize for women's peace struggles in Liberia on African women's rights and resilience. As you saw, we had the possibility of working with the National Domestic Workers Alliance and also with a group called Queers for Economic Justice in terms of working on the relationship between sexuality and economic justice. So to return to our messy but nonetheless exciting masthead for the Institute for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, I would like to say in conclusion that the work that the Georgia State Institute for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies has done for the last 20 years, and which its affiliated faculty and students did for the 2 years before the Institute was formed, is crucial to any possibility we have of making a better world. The choice before us is relatively clear: mobility for stasis or change for justice. But the only way to create the change we desire is to know the world in which we find ourselves. And for your contributions to this crucial project of knowledge, I want to thank you all. I'll make Julie ask a question if nobody else has any. Be prepared, Julie. Yes.
I really enjoyed, was that me?
Yes, you. I just was saying hi to you.
I really enjoyed your deconstruction of the progress narrative, and this is something Julie and I have talked about in terms of teaching. That whenever we have the international component of our classes, which we're paid to do, it tends to reinforce this binary.
Yeah.
That no matter how you want to present material about the rest of the world, that's always being threaded through this binary of, well, thank God I'm not in China, or thank God I'm not in wherever.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you had some thoughts about pedagogically strategizing around this binary.
That's a great question. I mean, my first year teaching at Arizona, I taught a course called Women and Religion, we worked on all kinds of religious traditions, and it turned out that the way the students were hearing this was a search for the most oppressed woman in the world. And that was one of the points at which I really started thinking about this. I think that one of the things that, I'll tell you how I do it, because thinking about religion and secularism is one of the ways that I try to get in this. I think that as much as Chakrabarty is talking specifically about secularism and about the ways in which people who live with the gods, by which he means people in India, he was part of the subaltern studies group in India, who just don't want to enter into this narrative at all, are treated as if they need to develop in some way. That his critique is also just about the way that we do knowledge at all. But that what I have seen through religious studies is that the various ways in which people live religious practices, and they're all different. There's a book, again, from the 1940s called Gods of the Metropole, which is about how people live with gods in urban areas, which is the opposite of this narrative, which is you live with your gods in your rural area, then you move to the urban area, and you enter the modern economy. And I think that the idea that we can be active about how it is that people live their lives both opens worlds to students and also means that we're not looking primarily for oppression. In one way, I mean, I went through a long critique of injustice here. I don't always teach about injustice because it does set off some sense that there's a comparative aspect to what we think about as injustice, as opposed to an approach that I would call a queer approach, but it doesn't have to be that way, which is look at all the different ways that it's possible to live in this world and to have what Saba Mahmood calls a life of human fulfillment. And that sense of trying to open up possibilities that are not contained within this narrative, it at least gives you an active, positive way to step out of it, as well as this long, critical way. And what you find is that, I'm sure your classrooms, I mean, I would love to say that Barnard College is as diverse as it should be given its geographical location, but it is not. But I'm sure that you have very diverse classrooms that where the students live in a lot of different ways. And even at Barnard, despite its constraints, that's true. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, here and then up here.
In what ways do you think that politics and the mediaism is disenfranchising people in terms of social progression?
So can you restate your question for me just a minute? So in what ways is I got the media?
Yeah, in what ways do you think that politics and the media are disenfranchising people in terms of social progression here in the U.S.?
So how does the popular media play into this narrative? All different kinds of ways. I mean, the one of the things that I've been very impressed with is the involvement of my students in various forms of Black Lives Matter activism. And a lot of that is, there are two different versions of the progress narrative that I've seen used to try to shut them down. One is no, racism is over and this is somehow, and this is strangely a hard argument to make in New York, but a lot of the national argument has been, well, there's a place called Ferguson, Missouri, where this is a real problem. And New York again is the metropolis, the urban area. It's where we're supposed to be cosmopolitan. And as you know, the police officer who killed Eric Garner with an illegal chokehold was also not indicted. So that connection has been very important. But that sense that this is all over except for this one place has been used a lot. In an earlier version of this paper, I had a quote from USA Today where people were responding to what Obama talked about in terms of his own sense of a relation to the dangers that African Americans face from state violence. And one of the respondents basically said, "It's over. It's time to move on." And this was one of the few times when Obama was personal. He's very careful not to be. And I think that sense that if you talk about personal feelings in relation to this, again, that you're just dwelling in a history that we need to see as having moved forward and has moved on. So I do think that these narratives do continue to have a lot of power to undo it. And even around questions of activism, too, where there's a sense of, well, the civil rights movement, and that's part of what I'm interested in about the long civil rights movement. It's not so much about the progress narrative, but that it had a specific form and it was successful, and why not just do that again, which is the do it over and over again. And I do think that some of the activism that's been happening around Black Lives Matter hasn't been taken as seriously as it might, because it doesn't look like the 60s again. Well, first of all, the 60s doesn't look like it did in the movie because there's a lot going on. And in retrospect, it looks like it was very successful, but at the time, it was very hard to know what was happening. So I think all of those narratives are very much in play in the contemporary moment, and that's just one issue that we can see it on. Yeah, good. All right, right here? Yeah.
Thank you. Je suis Marielle Degoué. Je viens du Bénin. Nous sommes 12 venant de l'Afrique. Et nous prenons part à un programme IVLP, International Visitors Leadership Program.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Marielle, and I'm from Benin, and we're part of a delegation of 12 women from Africa, and we're taking part in an IVLP program. That's the International Visitors Leadership Program, organized by the State Department.
Why don't you come up here so you can use this? No? Okay. Okay. It's so they can understand. Okay.
Okay. Merci beaucoup de nous accueillir et merci pour votre brillante présentation. J'ai deux questions à vous poser. La première, comment fait-on pour demeurer toujours aussi militante malgré les années?
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I have two questions for you. The first one is, how can you remain such a powerful activist over the years, over the course of time? How do you do that?
Deuxième question, ça concerne les travaux domestiques ou les filles domestiques qui font les travaux domestiques. Elle a parlé de remédier un peu ou mettre un terme à leurs travaux. Ce que je voudrais savoir, est-ce qu'ils ont une stratégie pour remédier à ce travail-là des filles qui travaillent dans les maisons? Et ensuite, elle avait parlé des travaux domestiques, les filles qui font les travaux domestiques. Maintenant, je demande s'ils ont une stratégie pour remédier à cette situation. Est-ce qu'ils pensent professionnaliser ce travail parce qu'il y aura toujours des familles qui auront besoin des filles dans les maisons?
And then my second question is regarding what you said on the domestic workers. Is there a strategy to make their work legal or to make it more professional? Because of course we know that this is a need that will always exist. So families and households need house workers.
Right. Yes. Yes. Thank you. Those are wonderful questions, and thank you for coming here today. I'll take them in reverse order. So on domestic work, yes, and on the website, there's a film of National Domestic Worker Alliance organizing, and then there is both a report which includes history of domestic work in the U.S. and its relationship to slavery and exclusions from labor protections, and their strategy for state-based action, which is to pass what's called the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights in U.S. states so that they're included in domestic worker in labor protections in the U.S. So the first one was passed in New York in 2010, and since then California, Massachusetts, I think Illinois, So there's that specific strategy to the United States. And there is also a strategy where they're connected to international labor organizing as well through international labor bodies. So that's exciting and important because most of the women in the United States who are doing the work come from various areas of the world. But they also have a broader critique about valuing domestic work. There's a group called Damayan, which is Filipina migrants in New York, and their report on domestic work is called Doing the Work That Makes All Work Possible, which is in some form or another we all depend on domestic work, whether it's unpaid labor that family members provide, caring for children, caring for, and my partner is disabled and a wheelchair user, caring for disabled people. There's all ways in which, in order for any of us to be here today, someone is doing domestic work that helps us to live, including and Saskia Sassen, who is a political economist at Columbia, makes a big point of this, all kinds of service economies that aren't domestic but that are related to domestic work. So restaurant workers who also have difficulty, for example, there's a big fight in New York now about tipped work where you don't get paid even a minimum wage. Not only is the minimum wage not a living wage, but if you're a restaurant worker, you don't necessarily make the minimum wage because there's a lower wage that your tips are supposed to make up for. So part of what they're interested in is connecting domestic work to other forms of marginal labor where activism has not focused because it's been so focused on industrial labor. And then as to how to remain a fierce activist, I've had very good fortune in that I've participated in movements that are very active. I became politically engaged through the anti-apartheid movement. I worked for the Presbyterian Church, and they put me in an office called the Washington Office on Africa, and that was a very powerful experience for me. Feminism, queer movements, AIDS movements, various forms of social justice movements, and then this, and I'll say this for my friends here from our cohort at Emory, good parties help. I mean, I think it's very important, you know, that we focus on the pleasures that life has to offer as well. I was in a session for our 40th anniversary conference on freedom schools that was run by Rod Ferguson and Che Gossett and Vani Naratamayan. And that session was about how we would make freedom schools. And I came away from that thinking, yes, we just need more fun for more people. And that way we will be able to sustain ourselves in this work. Because I have to say that, and I will say this about women's studies here in Atlanta, here at Georgia State, it is sustaining. I get great and wonderful support from all of the colleagues, students, working with students. I was on the panel for one of the plenary panels for our conference. One of the questions was about self-care, and I was like, working with my students is my self-care because they are such exciting young people, and it is a wonderful thing to be a teacher. It's very, very fortunate. So I think that that's one of the other ways that I'm able to, you know, continue on. And I will love to hear, perhaps in the talk afterwards, and unless someone wants to say it publicly, what your strategies are for staying strong. All right, any other questions? Okay, we have one more follow-up here, yeah?
Would you argue that globalization reinforces sexism, classism, and social stratification?
Yes, and it also depends on it. In other words, globalization could not have happened in the ways it has were it not for sexism, racism, that the idea that capitalism is somehow separate from these forms of social difference is one of the things that I've spent all my time arguing about. We have another issue of our web journal that's specifically on neoliberalism, where we had a convening with scholars from different parts of the world come into, and there's a film there called What is Neoliberalism? And it's about the ways in which gender and sexuality help to make globalization what it is, and globalization also then remakes sexism, racism in new forms. So, yeah. These are great questions. Anybody else want to jump in? All right, well, I hope to talk to many of you more informally about how you stay strong. Thank you.